So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, we're going to start with a bit of context about medieval and early modern society, so we know kind of where we're at. A little bit about religion and the different kinds of magic that existed in medieval and early modern England. And then we're moving on to practical magic, which is more my research, the magicians who were practicing it, who they were, what they got up to, and then some more about the spells specifically and what kind of spells were being practiced and what held them all together, because there is an internal consistency which people don't necessarily recognise in magic, but does exist. So, just to begin with, medieval early modern England. It's a very different place to the England that we think of now or recognise now. I focus specifically on the mid-14th to the mid-17th centuries, and this is a big time of change, turbulence, transition for the period for England. At the beginning of the period, it's a very rural society. There's only about 15% of people who live in towns. By the end of the period, it's about 25% who live in towns. In 1350, England is recovering from its first big bout of the Black Death. The population has been slashed in half, pretty much, well, not overnight, but over the course of about 2 years, and it's still recovering from that experience. It's also a time of massive change in terms of government. At the beginning of the period, again, we have a pretty much absolute monarchy. By the end, we have a republic. There's huge changes in religion, there's huge changes in the way that people worship, and it's an interesting time, let's put it that way. But it's also it's not quite as medieval as we tend to think. Medieval tends to have negative connotations. It's actually, it's a very well-connected country. The exchange of ideas is very sort of active during the time. You can see from this map, the main way that people communicate is via the waterways and the river networks, but there's also, that means that there's still enough movement to be able to kind of share ideas across the country. Most importantly for our purposes tonight is the fact that it is a deeply religious society. It is steeped in religion of all kinds and belief in God and belief in magic. And that's something that isn't really questioned during this period. So if we move on to religion, I can't emphasise enough, God exists, demons exist. You meet demons on the road on your way to work sometimes, and they offer to take your soul. And you can say yes or no, depending on how you're feeling on the day. It's a time when fairies exist, and because you've got God, you've got demons, you've got heaven and you've got hell, and that means that there's a door open to all sorts of other kinds of supernatural things. So we're literally living in a magical universe where things, there are powers outside of our control, and that's expected. I often get asked whether there's a strong pagan element in medieval and early modern society. The answer is yes, but not necessarily in the way we'd expect it. Christianity is a very porous religion. It likes to absorb stuff and make it its own. It's a bit like the English language. And in that sense, there's a lot of saints, for example, which are probably adaptations of earlier pagan ideas, which have been absorbed into the actions, and therefore a lot of the rituals that are performed during the period, both within Orthodox religion and outside of it, do have some kinds of pagan elements. So we've got that going on as well. And an example of that is the Green Man, which appears in a lot of grotesques and gargoyles in churches across the country. Now, there's a debate often about the importance of religion in people's lives and how devout your average parishioner was. It's questionable. I'm not going to claim that people knew exactly how the Trinity worked or exactly, their Bible back to front. But what they did know was that, as I say, God existed and that he intervened in people's lives, as did demons, as did other beings. Which means that we get a lot of strong customs and beliefs. That can be worshipping holy wells, occasionally turning dogs into saints, and knowing that there is something to call on beyond yourself and beyond normal human aid. And with that, obviously, comes a belief in magic. So, as far as I'm concerned, there's 3 types of magic that exist in medieval and early modern England. The first is one that we've all heard of, witchcraft, but witchcraft has a very specific meaning for early modern people. Now we think of witchcraft as being many things. It has many different definitions and it has many different purposes. It's debatable, we can have that debate later, but the broad understanding of what witchcraft was in the early modern period is essentially bad people using demons to do bad things. And it's a relationship of subjugation. The witch is subjugated to the demon or the devil, and in return the demon will do things for the witch. You can kind of see this in this image at the top. You've got a male and a female witch in this image, but the important thing is they've always got a demon by their side. That's where they get their power from, and that is the sort of the basic relationship they're kind of working with. Other kind of magic, which was broadly accepted, was ritual magic. And ritual magic is also using demons, but the other way round. So it's the kind of Faustian magic. It's the kind where the magician is in control of what's happening. You can see here that he's encircled in a nice safe ring of sigils, and he is summoning the demon, and he is telling the demon what to do. So he is the master as opposed to the subject. And then finally you have the cunning or the folk magic, which is mostly what I look at, which doesn't really fall into the demon paradigm in the same way. Cunning magic, it does have theory. I'm very strongly committed to the idea that it has a theory behind it, but it's a lot more flexible. Whereas ritual magic is normally something which is done by quite highly educated men, and witchcraft is something which is absorbed sort of through lots of different kind of cultural references. When it comes to cunning magic, that's a lot more, organic. It is fed from the people, by the people, and kind of used and adapted in ways that are useful to people. And for that reason, it can draw on a range of different things. It can draw on the individual ability of the person, the practitioner, or it can draw on demons occasionally. Sometimes it draws on fairies, sometimes angels, often God, mostly God. So it doesn't quite fall into the same category as the other two. What's also interesting about it is that there are very few images of people who do cunning magic because, as I'll get onto a bit later, nobody really cared about it. It was just a thing that existed, people used, and therefore it doesn't have the same sort of sensationalism as the other two. The reason I put service magic or practical magic at the bottom here is because ritual magic and cunning magic often have a useful or tangible purpose to its end. It's done to bring about a useful thing for the practitioner. Sometimes ritual magic is used to just kind of get divine knowledge or sort of forbidden knowledge, but a lot of the time it's used to do things like summon an attractive woman into the circle for some company. Witchcraft often, that does have a tangible end, but it's not a positive tangible end. But when it comes to some ritual magic and cunning magic, that is actually basically a tool. It's a very useful tool that people can use to make their lives better in some way. And to that end, it could also be bought and sold. Go back to this. And that's a bit of a controversial idea, but essentially from my research anyway, what I found is that there are a lot of people who are claiming that they have this magical ability to make people fall in love, to heal, finding lost goods, that's a common one, and also finding buried treasure. And there are people who are sort of offering these services for sale. You can literally go to your local magician and say, I have had my spoon stolen, please can you find it? And they'll go, yes, I will go away and do some magic and I'll let you know where it's gone. And these kinds of people, they don't have a stereotype of any particular kind, whereas we think of witches as being female, and they often were, and we think of ritual magicians as being male and very kind of Faustian and powerful. Cunning men and cunning women and service magicians, they're both. They're male and female. They're about 52% male, 48% female. Some would call that an overwhelming majority. They come from a range of professions, so they can be from the clergy, they can be skilled labourers, they can be teachers, housewives, schoolmasters, church wardens. They can be all sorts of different types of people. There's no one type. And one of the reasons for that is that this kind of magic is often treated as a side business to their main activities. So it's a little bit like psychics today. They will have an ability that they will kind of sell or use or offer to people that they think are worthy. But they'll also normally have something else they do on the side because they have this gift and it's not something which is necessarily expected to give them their full income. That doesn't mean that people didn't get strong reputations for being magicians, but there was, more to it than that. They also could be of any age. I think the youngest I found is 20. The oldest I found was apparently a centenarian, so at least 100. And they've been practicing for, over 50 years. So it's a broad category of people. So we've already discussed this, so I'll just leave that there. But cursing or harming, also occasionally something that you would call on a service magician to do. That's pre-witchcraft being a major concern, because then cursing becomes a more witchy activity. But before the 1540s, when witchcraft was outlawed as a secular crime, cursing was sort of treated as a bit of a superstitious bad thing to do, so you definitely shouldn't do it, but it's not quite witchcraft. Divination is one that I forgot as well. So the last thing to say about this before we move on to the spells themselves is just how punished service magic was. Now I'm going to give you some context here because this Act Against Conjurations, it was the Elizabethan Act, 1563, often thought of as the Witchcraft Act because it sentences witches to death for, again, doing things like wasting people away and killing them in bad ways. It also mentioned service magic, and this is pretty much the first time it's mentioned in any detail, and before that it was prosecuted by the church courts, who were responsible for moral correction, essentially. So if you were an adulterer, or you had superstitious beliefs, or you had not been going to church or something like that, that's what the church courts would be dealing with. And the only powers they had was put you in the pillory as the worst, possibly a fine, often just give you penance, possibly fasting for a week, that's bread and water, not eating at all, or declaring your wrongdoing in a church on a Sunday. After the 1542 Act and the 1563 Act, this is when service magic becomes an actual crime. And it's punished by a year of imprisonment for these things specifically, so finding buried treasure, finding lost or stolen goods, or provoking a person to unlawful love. Imprisoned for a year and then placed on the pillory four times in that year, and being asked to publicly declare what you've done wrong. Doesn't sound great, but this is also the period where you could be hanged for stealing goods over a shilling. So in that context, it's not really the biggest deal. And I think that's really important because it's actually showing exactly how high up the priority list this kind of magic was. It's not a major concern. It's not something that people are writing tons of pamphlets about saying, oh, we have a plague of service magicians, because actually it's just really useful. They're just sort of around the corner and doing what you need them to do. So the way I kind of think about service magicians now is to think about them a little bit like drug dealers in the modern day. They're people who are... You don't want to admit to using drugs, you don't want to admit to going to a drug dealer, but everybody in society knows that they exist, and if you really wanted to find one, you kind of know where to go. There's a sort of cultural awareness of where you might go. Exactly, you know what I'm talking about. So, yeah, it's like they're in society, they are kind of central to their communities. As I mentioned before, these are people who are clergymen a lot of the time. They are also labourers who worked in their communities. They are schoolmasters, they are housewives. These aren't people who are being shunned by their community, they're people who are in it. And they are doing really useful stuff. So, can move on to the spells. So, I'm going to be talking about some of the spells that were used during this period, and I've broken them up into 3 categories. So, to start with, I'm going to talk about divination spells, specifically spells that were used to discover lost or stolen goods or identify thieves. Then I'm going to move on to healing spells and some of the theory behind those, and then finish up with some counter-cursing methods, which you might find useful depending on how well you get on with your neighbours. The first 3 spells I've got for you are the divination ones, and I'm going to talk about the 7 shears, the book and key, which apparently still exists in sort of colloquialisms, like if you lose something, you've got to shake a Bible over the area that it might have been lost and then it will appear. Something I found out the other day, it was interesting. And turning the loaf, which is incredibly impractical, as you will see. So, the sieve and the shears is a really old practice. The earliest reference we have to it is from the, I want to say 4th century BC. Either way, it's an ancient Greek source, and it mentions that a common divination method is the sieve. It was probably used quite differently to how it was used in the early modern period. But the basic idea back then was that you take a sieve and you put beans inside it, and a little bit like reading tea leaves, you kind of shake the sieve and you listen to the way that the beans sound, and then like the way that the patterns form in the sieve will tell you the answer to your question. This basic idea of a sieve being really useful stays on, but the way that the actual spell works in early modern England has changed quite a lot. So according to John Aubrey, who is an antiquarian from the 17th century that you might have heard of, the way that you use this method is the shears are stuck in a sieve, and 2 maidens hold up the sieve with the top of their fingers by the handle of the shears. Then they say, by St. Peter and St. Paul, such a one hath stolen such a thing. So Bob has stolen my spoon. The other says, by St. Peter and St. Paul, Bob has not stolen it. After many such adjurations, the sieve will turn at the name of the thief. So if I had a sieve and a pair of shears, I'd kind of show you how exactly this method would work, but it doesn't really matter because it does vary according to which source you read. There are references to the sieve and the shears in 15th century sources, 16th century sources, and then in the 17th century one. And each one has a slightly different method that they use. This image, for example, shows a different method because the sieve isn't stuck on the shears, which would suggest it's been balanced on top and the shears are underneath. This is, again, really impractically held between 2 fingers, and you're waiting to see what the sieve does from there. Now, the important thing to kind of take away from this at this point is that, one, you're expecting the sieve to do something interesting. It's meant to turn, or it's meant to fall, or it's meant to sort of take on some kind of agency. It's also using 2 people, and they are maidens, which is interesting because maidens and virgins or prepubescent children are often used in ritual magic, especially because they seem to have a kind of purity which makes them more useful or more effective in spells. So they're often used as diviners, for example, because they're seen as like sort of cleaner vessels. And finally, you've got this St. Peter and St. Paul thing going on here, which we'll come back to, but just bear it in mind. And I suppose the other thing is that actually it's a binary question. It's a yes or a no. You're not going to get much more from a sieve than that. The book and key is very similar. Again, references to it throughout the period I look at. And again, it changes a little bit each time. So to go into a little bit more detail, this quotation at the bottom is from Reginald Scott, who wrote The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584. And he says that people, service magicians, practice with a psalter and key fastened upon the 49th psalm to discover a thief. And when the names of the suspected persons are orderly put into the pipe of the key, at the reading of these words of the psalm, if thou sawest a thief, thou didst consent unto him, the book will wag and fall out of the fingers of them that hold it, and he whose name remaineth in the key must be the thief. So here again, you've got the binary question, is it this person, is it that person? You go through the names until you get there. You've got the book wagging in this case, so moving again, so the book has taken on some agency. But this time you've got different items, and they are much more religious items. The book is a psalter, and all of these references pertain to a psalter. And the key, I think, is important because it's not just any old key. It's got to be a key which is, a big mortise key that you can put names into, possibly a church door key, something like that. It's going to have to be big enough to sort of stick stuff in. And if you look at this page from a psalter book here, this is St. Peter. And the symbol for St. Peter is the key, well, 2 cross keys, it's the keys of heaven. So there is a direct connection here between the items used and the psalm that's being referred to. It's again referring back to St. Peter and St. Paul, and that sort of ties us back into the 7 shears. So this suggests that people who are using these, they may not have had like a lot of knowledge about exactly how their religion worked, but they did have enough to be able to know that these words had power and these people had power. And if you draw on them and you kind of summon them into your life, then you can divert the power that they possess into something useful to you. So I tend to think of it a little bit like a stream and a water mill. You can divert the stream of power into something which is useful. The power is there whether or not you're using it correctly, I suppose, because bishops got very annoyed about this. This was not the right way to use this stuff, but it's still something which, you know, is extremely common. But yeah, if we look at the variations, William Wycherley, who used it in 1549, he's using it in quite a similar way, because he's again putting the names of the people he suspects into the pipe of the key, but then he's laying the key upon the verse of the Psalter book, so the book is presumably open at this point. He's reciting the same psalm, and when this verse was said over one of the names, so he's either saying the name of the thief while he's saying the psalm, or he's only putting one name in at a time into the key, the book and key turned round. That might be another wag. It might be that it fell, it might be that he actually closed the book and then he was waiting for the key, so the book to sort of swivel in his hands. And I spent a lot of time with books. If you put your hands like that on either side of a closed book, eventually something will twitch and the book will start to move. So that may be how he was holding it to get this answer. The Abbot of Coggeshall, who was by all accounts a horrible man, uses a similar method, but again with some variations. He takes a key, a book and a man's name, he puts the key on his 4th finger, and he says certain psalms and other ceremonies unlawful, certain psalms, possibly the Psalm 49 again, and if the book falls down, he believes presently the matter to be of truth. So he's using it for a lot more broad uses, not necessarily to discover thieves. It might be that he's using it to answer another kind of binary question, but either way it still has to be binary. But again, the book has agency. The key is still an important part, but it's on a different place this time. And he swears by this method. You'll probably know that 1536 is the date that he's being indicted for this, and that's 3 years after the break with Rome. Officially, we should be getting rid of Catholic practices, and there he is reciting psalms, using the book and key, and also declaring that Henry VIII is going to promptly die, which is presumably why this actually came up in court in the first place. The final one, 1448, earliest reference that I found to the book and key. And it says that the key is placed in a book, that is to say a psalter, with a bill containing the name of he who is under suspicion. It's all the detail we have. This might be a more rudimentary version of the same spell. It might be exactly the same as the others. But the important thing is that the key is placed in a different place each time. The book is held in a different way each time, but the important thing is that it's still bringing the same answer by falling down, and you still need binary question, you still need to recite the psalm. So, we'll come back to the terms of life in a minute, but I want to talk about this psalm because it's interesting, and again it shows a little bit about the understanding of the people who are using this spell and also the internal logic of the spell itself. So, it's a very long psalm, not all of it is relevant. The important part is in bold, and it says, "When thou sawest a thief, then thou contendest with him, and hast been partaker with adulterers." Which is a bit harsh. But it's basically saying that if you are complicit in a crime, you basically have done the crime, and in this case it is theft. And that can be all sorts of things. Adultery is actually seen as a form of theft at this time, because you're actually sort of defiling somebody else's goods. So it's basically saying it's not okay. And then a little bit further on, "Now consider this, ye that forget God, lest I tear you in pieces, and there be none to deliver." I.e., God is not happy about this. And the fact that this psalm is being recited shows that, again, God is being invoked, there is a particular purpose, it is thievery that is the problem, and if the thief is discovered, or it's asking for God to tell us who the thief is, because the thief doesn't deserve any quarter, hence the tearing in pieces. Right, finally, turning the loaf. Now, this is a really interesting method, as I say, because it's wildly impractical, it's really fiddly, and I think it died out in the 14th century. I've only found these two references to it, both from London, both within 7 years of each other, both of which apparently didn't work. Both of these service magicians were indicted because they were paid a fair amount of money to discover a thief on 2 separate occasions. And each time they put in this method and then it didn't work. The second magician, Richard Bearwald, actually summoned previous clients to say he is a good character, he's an excellent magician, and he definitely did find stolen goods in the past, but he was using a different method before. That's the issue. But yeah, it's a stupidly complicated method which involves taking a loaf and fixing in the top of it a round peg of wood and 4 knives at the side of the same. Now, I don't know whether you can see this image particularly well, but you've actually got that concoction wrapped around Richard Bearwald's neck in that image. That's an artist's impression from the 19th century, but it sort of shows basically what was meant to be happening here. So the 4 knives are stuck into the peg, which is then stuck into the bread. The knives are meant to make the form of a cross, and then some soothsaying and art magic is done over them. And then after that, you know who has stolen this particular person's cup. It is not great. Bread is, quite crumbly. Wooden pegs are quite large. Putting 4 knives into them in the corners, it's probably going to fall out. But you've still got a kind of pendulum system which has been created. You've got the peg, which presumably you would hold, and then the bread might twist slowly according to the names that you're saying. And the knives are being put in the shape of a cross, which again, it's invoking Christ. It's saying, come to my aid, I need you here, answer this question. Again, the soothsaying and art magic, I'm assuming that's a misappropriated psalm. I might be wrong on that, but that seems likely to me. But even though this is just really silly, it doesn't change the fact that actually it's still using the same basic principles. It's using, possibly, the psalm, it's using moving parts, it's using relatively accessible materials, and it's calling on this external intervention. And it's also relying on a binary question being answered. I say relatively accessible materials because, obviously, bread, knives, peg, pretty common items at the time. Sieve and shears, anybody living in an agrarian economy is going to have a sieve to sieve corn or other materials. Shears, again, very useful when you're shearing sheep or cutting anything, it could be secateurs in this case. And then the book and key is possibly the most inaccessible of the items because, again, this is a Psalter. Psalters are expensive, not everybody's going to have them, not everybody's going to be able to read. So this is, a little bit more of a luxury item, as is the key if it's going to be a big chunky one. But it's accessible for the people who are using it. So John Dixon was the cook to the prior of Stoneleigh Abbey. Abbot of Coggeshall was obviously the Abbot of Coggeshall. William Wycherley called himself a tailor, but he was also very much a professional magician. So he probably invested in this kind of material because, in his own words, he had to keep himself inside because he was in such popular demand. And Reginald Scott is actually researching this stuff for a living, so he knows about these methods. So these are people who would have had access to this material and are in the perfect place to be using this method over the other methods available. So they're all accessible materials, and that is important because this is a kind of common magic. It is something which is there are probably all sorts of other versions of these spells that were being used all the time. You pick something up and use it a little bit like a pendulum, essentially. The fact that these are the most common ones that sort of come up, well, Book and Key and the Seven Shears at least, come up over and over again, suggests that there was at least some kind of knowledge sharing or exchange of ideas that allowed this to spread across the country, because they are quite widespread. Okay. What's going on here? Right, okay, yeah, got it. Okay, move on to healing. Right, that's good. So healing has an even stronger internal logic, I would say. I'm just going to focus on two. There's many different healing practices at the time, but I'm going to start with the magic of girdles and belts, and then move on to written prayers. So, measuring the girdle is, again, it comes up all the time. It exists from the 14th century to the 17th century. Again, used in slightly different ways, but it makes a lot of sense when you start to think about it. So Elizabeth Mortlock, who was trying to diagnose a child at the time, in 1566 described this method after she was indicted for using cunning magic. And according to it, she started by saying 5 paternosters, as in the Lord's Prayer, in the worship of the 5 wounds of our Lord, 5 Ave Marias in the worship of the 5 joys of Our Lady, and 1 creed in the worship of the Blessed Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Apostles. And interestingly, they actually mentioned that she's doing this in the vulgar tongue, i.e. English. Again, 1566, England is broken with Rome. The Bible is being sort of spread in English, and services are now being given in English. So the fact that she's doing this in English kind of shows a little bit about the time that she's living in. After she's done this and she's invoked these powers and sort of imbued herself with them and sort of got them in the room, she measures the girdle or band of any such persons being sick or haunted from her elbow to her thumb, craving God or saint's charity that if they be haunted with a fairy, yes or no, she may know, and says that if the band will be shorter and her cubit will reach, if it be so, the band will be shorter and her cubit will reach further than it commonly does. It's really helpful that she's written this, because the first ones that I came across just said what's on the board now, i.e. If you measure the girdle, you'll know whether someone's sick. She publicly boasts that she can tell whether someone is going to live or die. It's like, great. How? But again, people are using it. This other woman, Agnes Porteous, she's saying that she inspects kerchiefs and girdles of men and women in the vulgar tongue, saying, "Thou art thus far in," measuring a belt or scarf. So there's definitely something here about the belt shrinking. Both Agnes and Elizabeth mention this. And definitely the measurement of the belt in itself is really important. There are 2 reasons for this. There's the magical reason and there's the cynical reason. The magical reason is that the belt is an incredibly intimate item. It's more intimate than your underwear, because whereas you might change your underwear between every 1 and 3 days, it's a medieval period, it's not that easy to do washing. The belt is something that you would wear every day, especially if you're from a middle or low income status. You're only going to have one belt. So the way you wear it, where you wear it, is going to be incredibly important. But also it's going to be something that's always by your side. It's going to absorb your sweat. It's going to be something which you rely on to keep trousers up, and it's going to be something that kind of absorbs your energy. So in that sense, it does have magical property, and there are actually healing spells that come from the girdle as well, where, for example, one woman cut the belt into several small bits and then sewed it back together as a way of healing. The cynical reason is that belts that are commonly worn are always going to show where they have been tied. The simplest belt is going to be a rope, and it's just going to be tied around your waist. It's going to be a knot. Somebody who has a consistent weight is going to have signs of wear at that point in the rope. If then the person gets sick, then the belt is going to change. Where it's normally fastened is going to change. So you can tell a little bit about that. The reason I say if somebody gets sick, it's going to change is because of the kind of illnesses which are being referred to here. We've got haunted by a fairy. Agnes Porto has also said that she specialised in healing fairy diseases. And when something's being haunted by a fairy or touched by a fairy, that normally means some kind of wasting sickness. They have suddenly, it's possibly something like cholera that's actually been contracted, but either way, suddenly the person has lost a lot of weight and they are unable to stand and they become extremely weak and they're just wasting away. So, if that's the case and it's been going on for long enough that you're concerned enough that you're going to go to a cunning man about it, or a cunning woman in these cases, the belt might show you something about that. There will be evidence of new wear in a different place. Might not be much, but there's enough that you might be able to do some cold reading from that. So, it's good for diagnosis. If there's sudden weight loss, could be a fairy. And if it's really sudden weight loss, the belt's gone from sort of this long, this wide to this wide, you can say a little bit about the prognosis as well. But again, they are intimate items, and I think that's important to bear in mind. This isn't just about cold reading, it's also a lot about people's understanding and connection to the things around them. A healing method as opposed to a diagnostic method is written charms. So I've got a couple of examples here. The first one's from Roger Clark, who turned up in London one day to a household where the wife was languishing sick with a fever. And he said, I can fix that. So he took an old parchment, cut or scratched across, being the leaf of a certain book, make that what you will, book tearing is terrible, and rolled it up in a piece of cloth of gold. And supposedly on this was inscribed Anima Christi Sanctifica Me, Corpus Christi Salva Me, Sanguis Christi Inebria Me, this is a typo, Cum Bonus Christus Tu Lava Me, which is Latin, obviously. And it says, Soul of Christ, sanctify me, Body of Christ, help me, Blood of Christ, drench me, essentially, and of your goodness or grace, wash me. And again, it's taking this external power and it's taking the most powerful parts of Christ, essentially. It's taking his blood, his body, his soul, and it's saying, cleanse this person, heal them. And she was meant to take this charm, which was all wrapped up, and place it around her neck and carry it around with her until she recovered. Now, the interesting thing about this is, well, a couple of interesting things. The fact that it's in Latin kind of gives it an impressive edge. Latin is a magical language, partly because it's so misunderstood or not understood by most people. You go into church, you listen to the priest speaking in Latin, and then all of a sudden the communion wafer has turned from just bread to the actual flesh of Christ in the Catholic tradition. Like, that is magic. So the fact that sort of Latin language has that ability is really, really impressive and powerful in itself. So, it's a good thing to sort of bandy around if you're a magician. It's also interesting because this wasn't actually written on the parchment, because Roger Clark couldn't write. So he said that this was what was written on it, and he claimed it in court, but then they unrolled the parchment and they found nothing on it. It was just cut or scratched. But it shows really impressive showmanship. He knew what he knew what the words should be, so he was able to defend himself in that sense. And he wrapped it in cloth of gold. This is like incredibly expensive stuff. He charged a lot for it, unsurprisingly. But it's something which acts a little bit like a placebo. If you have a cunning man come to your door and say, I am a magician and I can heal you, and then he gives you this expensive and impressive thing, and he says some Latin, he explains this to you, that is going to be a really powerful worker in its own right. So, magicians kind of sometimes border on the line of quacks. during the period. It's impressive stuff, but it's also, relying a little bit on their ability to kind of present themselves in a strong way. But doesn't change the fact that the theory's still there, as we see from George Towle, who used a similar kind of healing method in 1522, when he wrote, I'm not sure how he did this, Almonds are very small, but he wrote Jesus Christus qui natus, Jesus Christus qui resurrexit. So he's basically saying Jesus Christ who was born, Jesus Christ who was reborn, or was resurrected. And he's writing these on almonds, and then he's feeding them to his patients. So again, you're taking the written word and you're taking the Latin word into your body, and you're taking the power of Christ being resurrected into your body. Like, this is really powerful stuff. And if you bear in mind that some of the most common healing methods of the time from sort of university-educated doctors was things like powdered garnet and eating your own vomit. This isn't so bad. Might help a bit more. But yeah, it's still this absorption, and it's this it's again putting your faith in Christ. And the reason that this is magic is, apart from the fact that you're taking an external supernatural force and you're actually sort of reappropriating it for your own ends, is also because this was definitely not okay. It was something which the church got very angsty about, and was constantly trying to sort of stop people doing, because there is legitimate prayers and there are good ways of acting according to kind of like Orthodox Christianity, and this wasn't it. So as far as people at the time were concerned, this was definitely magic. Okay, so finally, we're going to move on to witch bottles, which is a form of counter-cursing. They are terrifying. These are, well, this is, they're a European import. They kind of arrive in England in the 1650s, 1670s. And they often rely on Bellarmine jugs, which is this jug on the board. And why I say they're terrifying is, firstly, they are violent bits of spell, and secondly, this guy's grumpy. So Bellarmine jugs are named after Cardinal Bellarmine, who, by all accounts, was extremely grumpy. And his face was just stamped onto these jugs, and often they were used as a way of importing things like wine or oil, but they were then reappropriated for other purposes, and one of the most common ones was witch bottles, because if you want to scare away a demon, put a grumpy cardinal on a bottle. The most common contents were pins or nails, not fingernails, just nails, hair clippings, actual nail clippings, the urine of the person who has been cursed, and a red cloth. And then what you do with these is you would boil them or bury them or drown them or burn them. As I say, European import, but the theory of these exists from an earlier period. So the purpose of them overall is just to rebound the curse that has been placed on somebody onto the witch that cast it. And again, that relies on a sympathetic link. It relies on the fact that when a witch curses somebody, that curse actually gets taken into the body, and it is causing a lot of pain, it's a lot of suffering, but also like that causes a link between the witch and the cursed, which is really helpful if you're trying to get rid of the curse again. So again, Reginald Scott, who we saw earlier, may have introduced this method into England when he sort of wrote about a similar thing which happened in Switzerland, apparently, where a man was being plagued by an incubus, as you do, and he goes to a cunning woman to try and sort this out. And she says to him, you need to pee in a pot and then you need to cover it. And then the witch will appear complaining of a full bladder because she can't pee. It's using the victim's essence and assuming that something about the witch has actually been sort of inextricably linked to the victim in order to get this to rebound. You're taking one person's suffering and you're making it into a tool to make sure the other person suffers. And this is used in England before witch bottles arrived by Joan Bailey. She knew a woman who had a child who had been bewitched, so she said that she should, the mother should take 60 needles and a halfpenny worth of pins, so talk about a big ball of spikes, wrap them up in a red cloth, and then she put that bundle in a fire, and she pierced it with a dagger, saying that it would soon bring the witch to the door. It did, incidentally. Because this is really unpleasant. You're hoping that all these things that you've done to this bit of red cloth, which represents the heart and represents the blood, it happens to the witch that originally did this curse. So you're hoping that they will have pins and needles, literally, that they will feel a burning sensation all over their body, and then they will be pierced in the heart. So it's serious suffering that's being rebounded, but it still relies on the same kind of sympathy that we've seen with the girdle as well. I had something else to say about that. It's completely gone out of my head. Where it's gone? Oh yeah, no, it's also connected to scratching, which was a sort of vigilante justice version of dealing with witchcraft during the period. So if you thought you were cursed, then one way to counteract that curse or stop the curse was to trap the witch and scratch them until they bled, and then you basically disarmed the witch by taking away some of their blood and making it your own. So it's creating another link, but it's also breaking a link by doing it. Okay, I'm almost out of time, which is fortunate because I've almost run out of things to say. So the common themes from this, already kind of mentioned it, but sympathy magic is very important. There is a strong connection with the things that people wear and the people who are acting on these things. Powerful words, mostly related to God, seem to be very important, but they have to be the right ones. You can't just choose anything. And finally, the practitioner's ability. These are professionals who are doing this, and that might be surprising considering things like the sieve and shears or the turning the loaf. These aren't things you need another person to do, but it's a bit like going to a tarot reader or a psychic today. It's not just because everybody can technically do it, anybody can get a pack of tarot cards, doesn't mean that that everybody's going to have the same gift or ability to use them. So that's very important as well, and that's why you get some cunning folk who become incredibly popular and need to stay indoors because people keep bothering them, because they have this ability that other people don't necessarily have. They've also got the authority to pronounce things which will be trusted. So one of the important things when you're identifying a thief isn't necessarily just to know who did it, but being able to say and literally confront them in the street and say, I know you stole my spoon because this cunning man said so. And there's at least 2 cases where the word of the cunning man was enough to get the person arrested. So that kind of authority is really important as well, and it just goes to show exactly how important these people were to their communities, that they were relied on to that extent. Final conclusions then. Practical magic is a tool. It's a supernatural one, and it's an esoteric one, but arguably not as esoteric as, say, law, which nobody understands, and probably easier to get hold of and probably cheaper, frankly. It's widely used and relatively poorly policed. Definitely was policed, and all the examples we've seen are from indictments, but most of them are things from things like defamation, for example. So if a service magician says, hey, you have stolen that person's spoon, then they might get taken to court in return with the supposed thief actually trying to clear their name, which is why we kind of have these cases in the first place. And finally, that spells are drawn from a broad theoretical framework. They're not always practiced in the same way, but they do still have the same underpinnings, which is really important when we come to think about the way that people believed and acted during the time, because it's not just that everybody was credulous, it's not just that people blindly accepted that magic existed and therefore they were silly. Actually, there's a very good internal consistency in these things. I think that's everything, so thank you very much.